21-year-old nobody had just said the thing out loud that millions of people had been thinking for years but were too afraid to say. It was 1992. MTV. The cameras were rolling, and Tupac Shakur, not yet the icon, not yet the legend, still just a young rapper from Baltimore and Oakland who had been in the game for less than 2 years, looked directly into that camera and said the name that nobody in hip-hop dared touch. Michael Jordan, the most famous athlete on the planet. The man whose face was on every billboard, every sneaker box, every Gatorade commercial in America. The man that every kid in every hood in every city in the country had a poster of on their bedroom wall. The man that the word untouchable had been invented for. And Tupac Shakur, age 21, with nothing to lose and everything to prove, called him out. Not with aggression, not with hostility, with something that cut deeper than either of those things, with disappointment. What happened next? Not in that MTV studio, not that week, not even that year, but 4 years later, in a documentary that Jordan would eventually make about his own life, would reveal something about both men that nobody had seen coming. A response that arrived too late for Tupac to hear. A confession that the man who had everything had been carrying something heavy the whole time. This is the story of two icons who never shared a stage, never had a conversation, never occupied the same room with any meaningful purpose, and yet managed to have one of the most important exchanges about power, responsibility, and what it means to come from nothing and make it, that the 1990s ever produced. To understand what Tupac said that day, you have to understand what 1992 meant. The Los Angeles riots had just ended. Rodney King had been beaten on camera by 4 police officers. The jury had acquitted all 4, and the cities had burned. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, but literally, with fire and broken glass, and 55 people dead and $1 billion in damage. The image of America that 1992 produced was not the image on the Gatorade commercial. It was something rawer and uglier and more honest than anything the marketing departments had been selling. Into that moment, hip-hop was doing what hip-hop had always done in times of crisis. Saying the thing that the mainstream media wouldn't say. Naming the thing that polite conversation refused to name. NWA had already made Straight Outta Compton. Ice Cube was making Death Certificate, and Tupac Shakur, 21 years old, was making Tupacalypse Now, an album so politically charged that Vice President Dan Quayle would call for its removal from stores. This was not a man who was going to stay quiet about anything, and the question that was burning in his mind in 1992, the question that became the interview, that became the moment, was a simple one. Where are the people who made it? Where are the people who came from where we came from, who have the platform and the money and the microphone, and who are choosing every single day to use none of it for the people they left behind? Tupac had grown up without money, without stability, without the kind of safety net that most people take for granted. His mother, Afeni Shakur, had been a Black Panther, had been tried for conspiracy, had raised him in a world where the relationship between Black Americans and power was not abstract theory, but daily lived reality. He understood, in a way that was bone deep and not intellectual, what it meant to be in a community that needed help and to watch the people with the ability to help choose not to. And Michael Jordan was the most visible symbol of that choice. The interview is there in the archives. You can still watch it. A young man who doesn't look like a star yet, lean face, eyes that are already older than his age, speaking with the directness of someone who has not yet learned that certain things are not said in certain rooms. You know Michael Jordan? Tupac said. I never seen Michael Jordan in the hood. Let's see Jordan come down to the inner city. Just a parking lot and just shoot ball with the kids. I bet you that would change their life. He kept going, because when Tupac Shakur started pulling on a thread, he pulled until the whole thing came undone. What about the ones that only have one basketball court in the whole neighborhood? I still don't know how to play basketball to this day, because instead of somebody teaching me, everybody used to laugh at me. Instead of me staying there being like, teach me, I just learned to be like, forget it. I won't learn. And that's real. I know nothing about sports because I had no kind of role model to teach me. Two things were happening simultaneously in that statement, and most people only heard one of them. The surface thing was the criticism. Tupac calling out Jordan for his absence from the communities that wore his shoes and hung his poster and believed in him the way children believe in things that feel larger than the ordinary world. But the deeper thing was the confession. A 21-year-old admitting, on camera in front of whoever was watching, that he didn't know how to play basketball because nobody had ever taken the time to teach him, that he had walked away from something he wanted to learn because the humiliation of not knowing was more available than the dignity of being taught. That was not a political statement. That was a wound. And Tupac had just held it up to the camera and said, "This is what it looks like when the people who could help decide not to." But here is what nobody talks about when they talk about that interview. Michael Jordan in 1992 was not simply a basketball player choosing comfort over responsibility. He was a man operating under pressures that the 1992 version of the public conversation had no framework for understanding. Jordan had entered the NBA in 1984 as a transcendent talent from North Carolina, the son of a man who worked in maintenance and a woman who worked in banking, solidly working class, not poor but not wealthy. He had watched his father work with his hands and understood what labor looked like from the inside. He was not a man who had forgotten where he came from, but he was also a man who had made a calculation. A cold, rational, strategically intelligent calculation about how power actually worked in America in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The calculation was this: a black man in America who wants to maintain access to white money, white audiences, and white institutions has to be very careful about how explicitly political he allows himself to become, not because he agrees with that arrangement, not because he thinks it is just or right, but because the alternative, speaking out, taking sides, becoming a target, carries costs that most people who are not that man cannot fully appreciate. In 1990, Jordan had refused to endorse Harvey Gantt, the black Democratic candidate running against Jesse Helms, one of the most openly racist politicians in modern American history, in the North Carolina Senate race. The quote that followed him forever was, "Republicans buy sneakers too." People heard that quote, and they heard cynicism. They heard a man who had sold his soul for a Nike contract, and maybe that's part of what it was. But there was also something else in it. A man who had decided somewhere early in his career that his power came from being beyond politics, from being so universal, so transcendent, so beloved across every demographic that nobody could touch him, and that the moment he stepped into the political arena, he would become a target in ways that would cost him not just endorsements, but something harder to quantify: safety, platform, the ability to continue doing the thing that he believed he was actually put on earth to do. This is the part of the story where the two men's worldviews collide in the most fundamental way possible. Tupac believed that power came from speaking, from naming the thing, from standing up in front of cameras and crowds and saying the unsayable, regardless of the consequences, because the act of saying it was itself a form of liberation. His entire artistic identity was built on this principle. He was going to tell you the truth about where he came from and what he had seen and what it had cost him, and he was going to do it loudly and publicly and without apology, because silence was complicity and complicity was death. Jordan believed that power came from transcendence, from rising so far above the thing that it couldn't touch you, from becoming so necessary, so universal, so embedded in the fabric of what people loved about their lives, that you could not be dismissed or destroyed or reduced. His entire brand identity was built on this principle. Be like Mike wasn't just a slogan, it was a philosophy. The idea that excellence itself was a form of liberation, that a black man winning, dominating, being undeniably the greatest at what he did, was its own statement about what was possible. Neither of them was wrong. Both of them were right. And the tragedy of 1992 was that they were never in the same room to work that out together. 4 years passed. Tupac got shot at Quad Recording Studios in New York in November 1994. He survived. He went to prison on a sexual assault conviction he maintained was unjust. He was released in October 1995, when Death Row Records posted bail. He made All Eyes on Me in a marathon studio session that produced double albums worth of material while everyone around him understood, on some level, that the clock was running. He made enemies, and he made music, and he lived at the specific velocity of a man who believes he doesn't have much time. Michael Jordan won his 4th championship in 1996. His 6th was coming. The Chicago Bulls finished the regular season 72-10, the best record in NBA history. The entire country was watching him, had been watching him, would spend the next 2 years watching him complete what everyone already understood was one of the greatest athletic careers in human history. On February 2, 1996, both of them were in the same building, the Forum in Los Angeles. The Chicago Bulls against the Lakers. Magic Johnson's second comeback game, a moment so significant that the arena was electric before tip-off, the specific electricity of people who understand they are watching something that won't happen again. Tupac was there with Suge Knight and others. He was 24 years old. He had been out of prison for 4 months. He was in the middle of making the most commercially successful period of his entire career. He watched from the stands as Michael Jordan, the man he had called out 4 years earlier on MTV, played 36 minutes, scored 17 points, grabbed 7 rebounds. There is no record of them speaking that night. No documented interaction. No moment that anyone has reported. But they were in the same building. And you have to believe that Tupac, sitting in those stands, watching Jordan move across that court, with the particular certainty of a man who had already decided what he was, thought about what he had said 4 years earlier, whether he still believed it the same way. Whether he had come to understand something in the years since that complicated the clarity of that 1992 interview. 7 months later, Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. He had just left the MGM Grand Garden Arena after watching Mike Tyson knock out Bruce Seldon in 89 seconds. He was in Suge Knight's BMW. It was 11:15 at night. A white Cadillac pulled alongside the car and fired multiple times. Michael Jordan was in Las Vegas that night. He had been at the fight. He had been part of the same motorcade of celebrities and athletes that had filled the MGM Grand that evening, moving through the city in the particular bubble that fame creates around itself, the limousines and security and velvet ropes that separate the people who have made it from everyone else. His limousine was one vehicle behind when the shots were fired. He didn't see it happen. He heard it. In the way you hear something and understand immediately, before your conscious mind has fully processed the information, that the sound means something has changed permanently. Tupac died 6 days later. He was 25 years old. For a long time after, Jordan said nothing publicly about Tupac. There was no statement, no tribute, no acknowledgement of the 1992 criticism or the February night at the Forum or any of the complicated ways their lives had intersected without ever quite touching. He said nothing, which if you understood Jordan was itself a kind of answer. Then came 2020, The Last Dance, a 10-part documentary about the 1997 to 1998 Chicago Bulls, their final championship season, the dismantling of a dynasty. Jordan had waited over 2 decades to make it, had waited until he could control the narrative on his own terms, had waited until enough time had passed, that the rawness of certain things had settled into something he could discuss, without losing the composure that had always been his most essential public characteristic. And in episode 6, the interviewer asked him about the role model question, about the pressure, about being the face on the billboard that every kid in every city in the country looked up to and believed in, about what that cost. Jordan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "If I had a chance to do it all over again, I would never want to be considered a role model. It's like a game that's stacked against me. There's no way I can win." 28 years after the Be Like Mike campaign, 24 years after Tupac Shakur had sat in front of an MTV camera and said the thing that nobody else was saying, the man who had been called out for hiding behind his brand, for choosing comfort over community, for letting the machine of his own marketability make his decisions for him, that man had just said, in front of millions of people, that he understood the weight of what had been put on him, that he had felt it every day, that if he could go back, he would have carried it differently. It was not an apology. Jordan does not apologize. That is not the architecture of who he is. But it was something, an acknowledgement that the thing Tupac had been pointing at in 1992, the unbearable pressure that fame places on a person, the way the expectation of role model status can crush the humanity out of the person being expected, was real, that he had felt it as the burden it was, that it had cost him something he couldn't get back. Tupac never heard those words. That is the part of this story that sits with you longest. The two men who had the most important public argument about black fame and black responsibility and what the people who make it owe to the people they left behind, they never resolved it. They never had the conversation in person. They never stood in a room together and said the things that the interview and the silence and the documentary were all gesturing toward. What Tupac said in 1992 was, "You have power and you're not using it. Come down from the pedestal. Come back to the parking lot. Shoot ball with the kids. Show them what's possible by being present, not just by being successful." What Jordan said in 2020 was, "I was never comfortable on that pedestal. I was never at peace with what it required of me. The version of me that you saw from a distance was not the whole picture." Both of those things can be true simultaneously. That Jordan failed certain responsibilities he had the power to meet, and that the weight of those responsibilities was crushing in ways that nobody outside of it could fully understand. That Tupac was right to call him out, and that Jordan was carrying something that Tupac's critique, however necessary and however true, didn't fully see. The tragedy is that they never got to say any of that to each other. One of them died at 25. The other waited 24 years to say the thing in a documentary that the dead man couldn't hear. And somewhere in that gap, between what was said in 1992 and what was said in 2020, between the MTV camera and the ESPN camera, between the young man with the wound and the old man with the confession, is something that feels like the entire story of what it means to come from nothing and make it in America. The cost of it, the loneliness of it, and the conversation that two men who needed to have it never quite got to finish.